becoming more.
There's some amazing to be there, some very meta.
Yeah, exactly. It's like at one stage, yeah, okay, but then it's not. It doesn't give any agency to talk. That is
Yes, because
and it's all massive sport. So I'm talking about the performance of Devon and his team performance and whatever. But I haven't. It's also not come out.
I think we can structure this out really quickly. I think we fine. Right, let's plough through this nonsense because this is all good stuff. I suspect that many of you will be able to draw on. As I said, the main model that we're talking about here is grouped under an umbrella term called media effects. The key person in the video game debate is a psychologist called Craig Anderson, who's carved a career, an entire career out of this. Now, if you want a really interesting thing to listen to on this, there's a podcast called The Psychology of Video Games by Jamie Bartlett. And Jamie does a couple of episodes on this debate. Jamie is a psychologist himself. His analysis of this stuff is really excavating and just absolutely slashes this stuff to bits. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not as well skilled in doing this, albeit I have a degree in psychology, so I understand bullshit when I see it. Now, Anderson's biggest paper on this came out in 2003, where he did a meta-analysis that revealed that violent video game effect sizes are larger than the effect of second-hand tobacco smoke on lung cancer, the effect of lead exposure on IQ scores in children, and calcium intake on bone mass. That was his conclusions from this. So, you might think, whoa, this guy's found something really important, that the relationship between violence and video games is stronger than the relationship between lung cancer and second-hand smoke. Well, he got warnings on packets about that. Sorry, it's been a stressful time. That looks like it's a really strong thing. The key thing about this is a meta-analysis. Now, a meta-analysis is something that psychologists employ as a method where they look at all the research that has been done in a particular area, and then they take the results, the statistical results of that research, and then analyse the effect of all those statistical effects put together. There's a massive flaw in doing this in that it amplifies weak effects. If you take a bunch of statistical measures, group them all into one, and then measure that as a whole, the tendency is to overemphasize the positive effect if you do that. It's a statistical issue. It's basically an issue with the mathematical models they use to analyze statistics. That if you take, let's say you're a correlation relationship of 0.1, which is an extremely weak correlation between two variables, but you add 1,000 of 0.1s and you put them into a meta-analysis, you come out at 0.4 or 5. Even though all the individual papers say it's 0.1. The meta-analysis of them would actually give you a stronger relationship because of that, because it's indicating that the relationship is stable over time, so it strengthens it. There's a massive methodological flaw in what Anderson does, but because the vast majority of people don't understand statistics and they don't understand meta-analysis as a method, nobody questions this. You know, Anderson can go to the media and say, look, I found proof. And they're like, holy shit, he's found proof, without being able to drill into where that proof came from or what the measures are of that proof. So most psychologists who would look at this would think, come on, he's a fraud. But then who listens to like people from the psychology department over there? Well, nobody, right? There's nobody sitting in an office over there. I'm not bad-mouthing those guys, by the way. That's just, like, I can use any university for that. They would understand that this is wrong. You know, stats people down on the Bay campus would look at this instantly and start laughing, because you know that's completely wrong. You know, the method used here is totally wrong for what they're trying to show. But nobody listens to those guys. This guy has found something quite exciting, so it's like, well, the media's going to jump on this. So Anderson's work, I still think there's something important in Anderson's work, because he does show that there is a sort of consistent weak relationship between violent video games and violent behaviour. What Anderson's work can't do is show what that relationship is. He can't show a causal relationship. Did they play the games first, or did they play the games because they were violent? Because this is a correlation study, so all he shows is that two variables are related. There's no cause and effect in correlations. It just says two things go together. For example, did you know that there is a strong correlation between the number of alcoholics in a place and the number of churches. Like, if you go to a city, you've got two cities, right? City A and City B. City B has got more alcoholics and it's got more churches than City A, because they're related to one another. Can anyone tell me why? Very simple answer. City B is bigger. More people. Therefore more alcoholics, therefore more churches. The two things have no causal relationship with one another whatsoever, but you can pair up variables like that to make it look like they've got a relationship with one another, and there is a correlation effect there. Correlation never implies causation. You know, I could take churches out and say schools, you know, or police officers, or roads, or traffic lights. You know, how mad would they say, like, walk up to you and say, do you know there's a relationship between the number of traffic lights in the city and the number of alcoholics in the city? That's true, by the way. That is absolutely true what I just said, but they're not in any way related to one another, those two things, right? It's like, you know, there's a relationship between the number of cat's eyes in the road in the city and the number of KFCs. Again, that would be absolutely true, but it's got nothing to do with them. So, what else is wrong with Anderson's view? Only done on American studies. So we should not generalize from America to the rest of the world. Social, political conditions are different in America to other places. And this is psychology research. It doesn't consider culture in any way, shape or form, which is a problem. One of the things that Anderson's work does not do in any way is define what a violent video game is. And I think that's an important definition to make too. Now, this over here is Street Fighter 2, right? If nobody's ever played Street Fighter 2, they're welcome to go to the room down in Callahan building where I have an arcade machine of it. It's a lot of fun it is too. Although, the other week when I was down there, some youngster from the first year beat me. And that nearly ended in a violent fucking incident, let me tell you now, right? Because he was giving it large as well, I was not impressed. I spent a lot of time in the night playing this fucking game, not to be beaten by some 18-year-old who just fucking walked in off the... Anyway, now, is that a violent video game? Because it don't look like it. It looks like a cartoon to me. You know? Look at what Chun-Li is doing on the right. Is that something that people can do in everyday life? Like sort of do a high kick, which makes lightning come out of your foot. And you know, and the E-Honda, the sumo wrestler, he's going like, you know, and it's like, you can't really do that with that kind of speed, you know? This is not realistic in any way, shape or form. The characters in this game are not realistic. They are imbibed with supernatural powers. You know, this isn't, is it violent? Well, I guess it's violent in the same way that Tom and Jerry is violent. Or the Roadrunner cartoons are violent. You know, when I watch Roadrunner, and one day, Wile E. Coyote is going to get that fucking bird. One day, I live and hope on that. But when Wile E. Coyote gets fucking, he falls down a cliff or something, and you hear, and poosh, at the end, and something then falls on top of him as well. I'm not there like, oh, fuck me. Next time I go down the ceiling, I'm going to boot someone off the cliff and see if that happens. That doesn't occur to me to happen, because I know that's not. I also know that, like, you know, if that did happen to a poor coyote, they wouldn't be able to walk off with a lump on their head and then go back to trying to catch the Roadrunner afterwards. You know, I'm aware that this is not real. I'm aware that this is not real. You know, this isn't violent in the way that, you know, I felt on Saturday when I went to watch the Swans, where I wanted to run on and batter every one of Swansea City's players because they're fucking inept. This is not the same kind of thing. Is Grand Theft Auto 5 violent?
Makes me violent.
Well, that's a different issue altogether. I mean, we don't think that, like, Mikey and all the guys and Trevor are real people, right? You know, they're not. And they're not killing real people. You know, you know, it's like, we don't have this debate about movies. You know, we don't have this debate about the Avengers movies, but like literally at the end of every Avengers film, tens of thousands of innocent people must be killed, if that is in any way realistic, when some kind of city gets absolutely destroyed by some metal dragon snake looking fucking thing that flies through buildings and stuff like that. I don't sit there watching and think, what am I doing now? This, I am aware this isn't real, and like the tens of thousands of collateral civilian deaths that would occur in this sort of thing. What is this is a film. There's no real people getting killed here. We know this isn't real. What Anderson's research does is completely ignore that. It works under the premise that the violence that we experience in video games is somehow realistic to us. I mean, quite simply, it isn't. If I'm playing Mario and I'm jumping on a turtle and then booting its shell, I don't turn around and think, oh my god, that poor turtle. What does this mean about me as a person? What? No, that's not how it works, And so how far do you extend this? Space Invaders, is that violent? I'm a little spaceship shooting at things, and what, should I not be shooting at the aliens? Should I instead be welcoming them? Maybe have a party? What the fuck, like? No, it doesn't. The violence is a mechanism in these games. It isn't. But I have never seen two people face up on the street like Street Fighter 2. And start making the noises as well. No. That would be amazing if that happened. But I have never seen it happen. I think that's. So, there's a lot of research in psychology that suggests this entire strand of research is wrong. The procedures of actually measuring aggression are extremely questionable. Aggression, when it's measured by psychologists, is taken out of the context in which it would normally happen and studied in laboratories. So it doesn't look at how aggression is actually perpetrated in everyday life. What that leads to is the suggestion that aggression, as reported by psychology studies, is actually much more widespread than it is in everyday life. Everyday life is not as aggressive as psychologists would have us believe. The links between game and real-life violence are drawn from bad or irrelevant research and unfounded news reports. I've struggled to disagree with that. And researchers approach games like other media, ignoring that games acquire their meaning and use. You cannot interpret the content outside of the practice. This is a very fundamental problem with how psychology researchers treat video games. They ignore the fact that we actually play them instead of watching them. They seem to think that we're disengaged observers in the action, but it's actually through the action that we understand the context of how these things are actually going to occur. So these are all significant problems with how video games are studied. We can actually look at theories which suggest video game violence is a very good thing. So catharsis theory underpins the idea that game violence is actually very good. So, a naturally highly aggressive and violent person like Alice, right? She has benefited from playing Grand Theft Auto 5 because she can displace her urge. Like, she comes into my office and I always think, oh God, okay, put things away now because she's going to pick up something and bludgeon me to fucking death with it, right? So I'll put away all the heavy objects. But that's not been a problem over the last couple of months because you've been playing Grand Theft Auto 5, right? And you've been displacing your natural aggression into the game environment and therefore achieving a catharsis. Now, has anyone been in this situation before? You've had a really bad day and then what you do to deal with that is turn on a video game of some description and kill a load of shit. No. Jem, you will. This is something that actually happens quite often for me. If I'm had a bad day at work, Richard's getting a tip or something. Right, I will go home, I will load something up, something which involves the meaningless slaughter of lots of things. And I kind of feel better after doing that. I've worked out my aggression. Perhaps not aggression is the right word. I've worked out my frustration. Frustration and aggression are very closely linked together, physiologically in particular. So there are ways that we can use video games to actually improve our psychological state rather than worsen it and become more violent and frustrated. Actually, we can use them to displace those feelings as well. So, the research of Kuttner and Olson indicates that a lot of people actually play violent video games for the complete opposite reason. Not to be violent, but instead to deal with negative emotional states and resolve them in a safe manner. You know, because there's nothing wrong and it's not unsafe to go and kill a whole bunch of people in Doom. Yeah, that's fine. Nobody's hurt, nobody cares, it's alright. It would be much different if we decided to exercise that frustration by, you know, I don't know, walking into the Uplands Tavern and just starting battering people. You know, that's not a good way of dealing with your frustration. But, so this idea of catharsis is actually very important. And it does draw us into a discussion here that if you're going to suggest that, you know, a violent video game might have negative consequences, well, we need to actually incorporate that there could be positive consequences to this also. The ability to exercise your frustrations in a safe environment is actually a very, very good thing. That would make it no different to going to the gym, you know, or going to do, I don't know, a martial art or something like that. You know, it's a way of dealing with frustrations in a safe environment that, that exhausts the source of frustration, so you no longer have negative consequences from it. What's problematic about catharsis theory is not just that there's a lack of empirical evidence, it's a really, really difficult thing to test. It's an extraordinarily difficult set of variables to actually isolate here. You're relying almost exclusively on people's self-reported data in interviews, basically, about why you do things. In a sense, that's fine, but there is, in particular in psychology studies, but in any kind of empirical research that involves interviews, we encounter something called the halo effect. That people will tell you things which put them in the best possible light. So people will not tell you, yeah, I play violent video games because I've got a fantasy about killing children. They're not likely to tell a psychologist or anyone else that that is the reason why they do something. So it's a classic problem with any kind of empirical research that relies on questionnaires or interview data, is that, you know, people actually, they kind of lie. They will tell you things that they think either you want to hear or that will position them in the best possible light that there is. That's why we call it the halo effect. It's like, oh, look, I'm an angel, you know? So it's a little bit, I mean, I kind of, just anecdotally from my own experience, I think catharsis theory has some merit, but we do have to take into account that there's it's not just that there's little evidence, it's virtually impossible to fucking prove anything with catharsis theory. It's just a set of ideas that we can't deploy. In terms of cultivation theory, now, Connor mentioned cultivation theory earlier. Cultivation theory would argue that we're socialised to acting in particular ways, and when we see violence in games, we become violent in life. It is that simple sort of argument there. What the problem with cultivation theory is that it ignores a lot of other factors which could influence behaviour, like biology, for example. Now, there is ample biological evidence to suggest that some people are more violent than others by virtue of their biological makeup. That some people have a predisposition to overproduction of testosterone, for example, which high levels of testosterone are associated with violent behaviour. Again, it's not a causal thing because people might exhibit other forms of behaviour as well with high levels of testosterone. What I always think is much more important is that cultivation theory can't explain the wider environment in which these things happen. It's like, okay, we've got a kid here who's playing a violent video game and then they're going out and exhibiting violence. Okay, fine, well, what other violence is going on in the home when they're playing those video games? What's their relationship with their parents like? What's their relationship with their siblings like? What kind of cohort are they in the school? What are the other kids like? All of these things are important in understanding the context in which violence actually develops and is exhibited. cultivation theory doesn't ask those questions, because it relies on this idea that one form of thing cultivates a particular form of behaviour. So again, it's a classic media effects model, and it's very, very simplistic in Gosper. Social learning theory is the basis of the effects model. This, again, kind of that's what you were talking about with Albert Bandura. He's associated with social learning. This is the idea that mass media contains clear messages which impact on a passive audience. People copy things they see in the media. Already, the really problematic word is there. The idea that an audience is passive. That we just sit there and take it all in and act accordingly. We never do that. Everything we encounter, Jay, it's like we're just talking about the Mario RPG, right? So Jay wants to do the essay on the Mario RPG, which has just been remastered and re-released for the Switch. You can't play that game unless you've played a bunch of other Mario games. It won't make sense. I don't think, I don't know what the point would be. It would make no sense whatsoever to play that game unless you had at least played Super Mario World beforehand, which it was originally a development of rather than a sequel to. I don't want to call it a sequel to, but it impinged on you needed to have played Super Mario World in order to understand what happened in Mario RPG. There's a context, basically, is what I'm saying. Right? The game itself is meaningless without that context. In order for us to understand things contextually, we must, by definition, be active. We must be bringing things to the media experience. So, you know, if I pick up a newspaper, let's say, for some unbeknownst reason, I picked up the Daily Mail. I don't read the Daily Mail as a neutral reader. Right? I read it with the full history of the Daily Mail prints absolute shit and is, you know, prejudiced against these people and these people and these people, and that's the context in which I'll read it. And so therefore I'm flicking through it and that's bollocks, that's bollocks. I'm not even taking it at face value. You know, it could be the case that it's not all bollocks. Actually, I mean, I could get to the sports pages and okay, fine. But I'm not likely to do that, and I'm thinking death shit as well, like, you know. I'm never going to be approaching things in that neutral way. We are never passive in that sense. We are always active. We are always bringing things to the table. So social learning theory falls down, basically, for the first thing when it says, yeah, we're just neutral. And the reason why it still retains an attraction is because there is the idea that you can apply that idea to children. The children will approach things in passive ways. The children don't have that wider context. I think that's extremely naive. I think children have a context as well. Now, they might not be able to articulate it as well as we do, but that doesn't mean that they haven't experienced other media, that they don't have other influences, that they don't approach things understanding it in a particular way. It's all based on Bandura's Bobo doll experiments of 1961, where, you know, very quick overview. Are you all familiar with this? Yeah, you all know about this? Can I skip through it? Because rather than plaster on a fake smile and plough through this shit once again. I mean, the Bobo doll experiment is a gloriously misguided piece of academic research. Because, for one basic idea, you take kids and put them in a strange room with a bunch of things for doing violence and an object, and then you say, oh yeah, they did it because they copied this thing. And it's like, what else were they supposed to do? Kids don't exist in this kind of room. Nobody exists in this kind of situation. This is so unrealistic in terms of how everyday life is. It's untrue. I mean,
isn't it considered like a heuristic response, like the fact that they use like pre-existing knowledge to like act upon that?
Exactly. What I think is the most problematic thing with Bandura is he weirdly ignores psychology. There's a school of thought in psychology called behavioural psychology, right, which is concerned with classical and operant conditioning. Now, the principles of classical conditioning are really, really simple and straightforward. It's the way that you train dogs to do things, right? You pair a stimulus with a behaviour. And if you do that often enough, then it will become a learned behaviour. So when you're training a dog to sit, you will pair the word sit with a treat. And if they perform the behaviour, they get the treat. And eventually the dog will associate the word sit and the behaviour with getting a treat. So they keep on doing it. This is how animals live effectively, right? That's what Bandura was doing in that experiment. He was classically conditioning those kids. Basically, they saw a video of an adult being rewarded for acting violently. So they came to associate, if I act violently, I too will be rewarded. Right? Well, I get that. That doesn't mean that kids are violent. That means that you've set up a bizarre situation in which you've made a classical conditioning happen with kids because you're going to reward them for something. If kids aren't rewarded for violence in everyday life, then this isn't a problem. Maybe you want to look at wider society that might reward violent behaviour. Instead of saying, you know, the media does this, well, the media doesn't reward violent behaviour in a vacuum. There's something social about this. You know, if as a society we say, you know, violent behaviours should be validated and, you know, made to be glamorous in some way, well, that's a social issue. That's not a media issue, because the media and society don't sit apart from one another, you know. So I think that's the major problem. I mean, for David Gauntlet, the major problem is here the idea that any medium will hold a singular message in which anything will just be conveyed problematically. So when we talk about video games, why would we assume that children only play one game? Why would there be assumption made about Klebold and Harris that they only played one video game? That Doom was the only game they played? Because guess it wasn't. You know, they played a lot of Mario, Super Mario World, for example. You know, did that make them shoot up the school? Unlikely. You know, and believe me, if that had been suggested, Nintendo would have sued the fuck out of everyone who had made that suggestion as well, because unlike ID Software, Nintendo's got deep enough pockets to make sure that that kind of story is never covered in the media, because they are shit scared of Nintendo. Interestingly, for the same reason, you will never see somebody criticise Spider-Man or Spider-Man 2 in the media, because who makes those games? It's an in-house development of Sony. Sony's got deep enough pockets to sue any media company on the planet. Nobody is going to make that argument about that game. There's a very interesting politics that goes on with this debate. It's like, if the company is big enough, and that's what's going to be interesting about the reaction to Grand Theft Auto 6, because Rockstar is big enough now. When GTA 4 was out, and even when GTA 5 came out, but since Red Dead Redemption 2, it's big enough now to take on the likes of tabloid newspapers and sue the asses off them. And it will as well, I think. And we might see a very different approach going on here. So anyway, this idea that, you know, what Gauntlet is drawing our attention to is any argument that suggests violent video games cause violent behaviour does two things. One, it gives too much power to the medium. And two, it ignores the fact that we might do other things with that medium as well. That we might be engaged in other forms of gameplay, for example. Arousal theory is a very, very simple, and I mean simple, way of looking at things. It basically works on a very simple premise. If you are over-aroused and overstimulated, you will be violent. That's it. So a video game might over-arouse you and you might exhibit violent behaviour. You might exhibit any number of other behaviours as well because of over-arousal. That's why arousal theory is such a stupid idea. Cognitive neo-association model is, it sounds really fancy, it's not. This is the idea that specific emotional states and memories are represented in nodes in what is called semantic memory. So playing violent video games will make us create associations in our brains which can't be broken. This isn't considered even remotely good science anymore. We now have, since the mid-1990s, we have a principle called neuroplasticity, which argues that these ideas that brain connections are fixed over time is actually wrong, and actually the brain is much more plastic than we originally considered. It's not hardwired in the ways that we were. But you still see this neo-associative models come up in the media, actually. That, you know, if kids are exposed to violent video games when they're very young, they will create connections between violence and reward, which won't be broken in the future, and they will continue to rely on those brain models. So it's like the brain has been hardwired to think violence is a good thing. Impossible to prove. Absolutely impossible. You can't cut someone's head open and look for this connection, because that's not how the brain works. And as I said, there's a wealth of psychological evidence now which suggests that these neo-associative models really aren't the way that the brain works, that there's a far more plastic sort of way that the brain works than this. And then we have the old classic, the general aggression model. You will see that it is from Anderson, the same Craig Anderson that I was talking about earlier. Anderson's model is a dynamic social cognitive developmental model that provides an integrated framework for domain-specific aggression theories. I've copied that from his website. It sounds really good. It's complete bollocks, unfortunately, but it sounds really good. There is a framework here in the general aggression model which states individual differences in self-control and situational factors that undermine or bolster self-control produce a state characterized by varying levels of self-control fatigue. I don't know what any of that means, to be quite honest with you. Basically, what Anderson's general aggression model means is that self-control gets altered by the situation. So he posits that aggressive behavior is a deficit in self-control, firstly. That basically most of the time we're in the normal state where we control ourselves. When we act aggressively, we are no longer in that state. Okay, I'm not massively pleased with that, but you know, it seems a massively over simplistic model. And therefore it is situational factors which alter the extent to which we are in control of things. And because of that, because of individual differences, some people will have more self-control and some people will have less. So it is easier for the people who have less, the environment makes it easier for them to tip over. And therefore, violent video games, too much, they tip over into violent behavior. It's a whole bunch of nothing, basically. It really doesn't offer any explanatory behavior at all. It's the problem with all of these things, they're all psychological approaches, they ignore culture. They ignore the wider culture in which we exist. They're all experimentally based. Experiments in psychology are notoriously unreliable because they're unrealistic. They all decontextualize how we play things. They take play out of the environments in which we do them and put them into an experimental setting. None of them really explain anything. They're all very culturally biased because they deal with American models of violent behavior. Violent behavior in America is unique. Violent behavior in this country is a bad thing, but I think we could probably agree as a group that if things kicked off in this country, we wouldn't have the same effects as if they did in America, where everyone's totting weaponry, you know? What I would say is, despite the idea that none of these approaches have any kind of clue, there is something useful here. There is the idea that there is a persistent but non-causal relationship between violent media and violent behavior. I don't want to say violent video games, but violent media, which implies that we should do more to understand the relationship between these two things. I want to draw on this theory once again in this module, of course, Ian Bogost's procedural rhetoric. Bogost's argument is that games, arguments are modelled in the processes of a game, and therefore the game characterises a particular set of ideas because of this. What we should be encouraged to do is think about the violence in games, therefore. Not to demonise the violence in the games or to say that the violence causes things to happen, but think about what the purpose of the violence is. Because as a player, we are being asked to do violent things. What exactly is being said about us as people, about the developers as people, about our wider context and wider society, if we are being asked to do these things? And therefore, what does that say about how we understand events as well? So Bogos makes the argument, for example, that in war games, he was in particular talking about early sort of Call of Duty stuff here, decontextualizes war from the geopolitical situation in which war takes place. So, for example, Connor, you're doing some work at the moment on understanding how the Ukraine-Russia war has been reported. What you're trying to do effectively is what we call hermeneutics. You're trying to understand how the events have been translated, and therefore how that translation of events fits into a wider frame of translation for the particular organisation you're dealing with, the BBC. Okay? So you are not ignoring context. In fact, what you are doing is drilling into the context in two ways. One, you've got the context of the events themselves, but also you've got the context of the history and the style and the methods of reporting and the audience of that organisation themselves. And that will produce a particular kind of product. Right? War games don't do that. You know, if you're playing something which is a recreation of a World War II battle, you're not given the context of how that battle took place. You know, you were just chucked into the middle of it, and so you know, here are a bunch. Does anyone actually play as the Nazis? I hope not. That would be kind of
But killing babies and
well, you know, they're different things. And decontextualises the soldier from this as well. And you know, as a society, we're kind of encouraged to do that. You know, we've got to support the troops. Okay, do we have to? You know, fuck, really? I don't usually support people that just go to the desert to kill brown people. But there you go. You know, we as a society, we're supposed to do this. So Bogos encourages us to actually consider the argument being made by the violence. That will tell us a lot more than condemning the violence outright. You know, and you know why we're being asked to do this. There is no clear evidence of causation, and there never will be. It's never going to happen. There will never be a golden, you know, there's never going to be a smoking gun here. There are sensible reasons for game classifications and restrictions on children, I think. I'm not a big censorship person, but I do think it's kind of appalling. Red Dead Redemption 2, right? The day it came out, I went to Tesco in Forest Park to buy a copy at like 7 in the morning. Okay, so get up there. It's out. As soon as you walk into the supermarket, it's literally, they've got a thing in front of you with copies of it there. Pick one up, go over to the, because there were no games in the thing, you had to go over to the customer service desk and they put a disc in for you. I'm like 8th in line, okay? What am I at the time? Like 37 perhaps, something like that? I'm not young, okay? I'm the youngest person in that line. Everyone in front of me, this is going to sound awfully stereotypical, I do apologise, right? Everyone in front of me is clearly the mother of a child between the ages of 8 and 13, because you can tell, right? They're all buying this game. Do I think that all these mothers of a few years older than me are playing Red Dead Redemption 2? Are they fuck playing Red Dead Redemption 2? They've dropped their kids off at school and been told, go and buy this game for me. The game has a very clear warning on the front of it that this is for 18-year-olds and over. Does anyone care about that warning in video games?
Yeah.
I know we don't really care about it in terms of films either, I know that, right? But it seems even less so with video games. It's like, you know, when did you start playing it?
When it came out.
How old were you?
2018. I'm 21 now, so
You were too young to play.
yeah, I was under 18, yeah.
Yeah. I think those restrictions act for, let's say, I'm trying to do the maths in my head now.
16,
5
right?
years ago, 16
Yeah.
ago, right? 16 I think is fine. I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. 8, I've got slightly more problems with what's going on there. You know, I don't call me a prude or anything, but I think there's something slightly amiss there. Like, the media and conservative commentators use games as a way to attribute blames for social problems. There's no question about that. That is a truth. And there are some really questionable games. And we should perhaps ask the question why there are questionable games in the first place. And I'll leave you with that image there. That is a game called Chiller from 1986. You might be able to find this game as an emulated game. You'd never find a copy of it. This is a Nintendo NES game from 1986, where basically, well, it's horrendous. You have a dungeon in your house with people chained up, and the game and how you score points is to kill them as awfully as you possibly can. That is the whole point of the game. That is it. There is no other point to it. So at this point, he's using a machine gun on them to like mutilate them as much as possible. But you've got axes, like machinery, like you can feed them into a wood chipper and stuff like that. And you ask the question, why? Why did anyone make this game in the first place? Well, perhaps that's a more fundamental question we should be asking rather than, Manhunt, for example. Why make that game? What is the fucking point of that game? You're basically being a serial killer, right?
Yeah. It excuses itself because you're killing other serial killers, but you're supposed to commit violent acts, so
yeah,
in 1 point.
It's really tenuous, though. But I kind of enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the Wii version where you actually have to physically do the actions. Okay, I don't think we've got time to go over assignment 2 now, so I promise I'll go over it at the beginning of next week. Okay? We will do it in time. And if people aren't here next week, which is a distinct possibility, obviously it will be recorded as well. So I don't think anyone should have any problems with that. And I promise in the interim of this week, I will put some examples of assignment 2 from last year on Canvas as well, so you can have a look. And I will only choose